Dr. Zorak of the Solthar Alliance had encountered many strange life forms throughout his long career as a xenobiologist, but none could have prepared him for the enigma of humanity. The humans were a relatively recent addition to the Galactic Federation, and their biology fascinated countless scholars. They could endure extreme environments, process a vast variety of substances, and recover from wounds that would devastate most other species. Their remarkable toughness was almost unbelievable, and Zorak had dedicated himself to uncovering the secret behind it. The assignment to the joint human-Solthar research station orbiting Zeta-24 had seemed like the ideal opportunity to study them firsthand. Zorak had spent 6 months with the station's human team, observing, conducting interviews, and engaging in occasional debates about their puzzling behaviors. On the morning that would alter everything, Zorak was in his laboratory, organizing his notes on human circulatory systems. The lab was immaculate, with shelves lined with clearly labeled samples and equipment calibrated to perfection. He had noticed that humans seemed content to tolerate a certain degree of chaos around them, an oddity he planned to investigate further. As Zorak worked, the door to the lab opened with a hiss, and a familiar voice interrupted his concentration. "Morning, Doc," said Brian McLeod, the station's chief engineer. Zorak looked up to see Brian, a tall man with broad shoulders and perpetually unkempt dark hair. His laid-back demeanor both charmed and irritated Zorak. "Good morning, Engineer McLeod," Zorak replied, his antennae flicking slightly. "You appear disordered." Brian grinned, though his expression was hollow. His skin had a pale hue, and there was a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Yeah, I'm not feeling too hot," Brian admitted, leaning against the doorframe. "Think I've caught something?" Zorak immediately set aside his notes. Illness was never something to be taken lightly. "You are unwell? Have you notified the medical officer?" Brian waved him off. "Nah, it's just the flu. Happens every year around this time. I'll be fine in a couple of days." Zorak froze. "The flu? That is a viral infection, is it not? Should you not be in isolation?" "It's not that serious," Brian replied, his voice hoarse. "I'm just going to rest, drink plenty of fluids, and maybe make some soup later." Zorak's compound eyes narrowed in confusion. "Soup? What possible benefit could soup have in treating a viral infection?" Brian chuckled, but it quickly turned into a cough. "It's just what we do, Doc. Works every time." Zorak watched as Brian shuffled out of the lab, muttering about needing a blanket. This was absurd. On Solthar, even the slightest indication of illness would trigger a battery of treatments: antiviral nanobots, immune boosters, and strict isolation protocols. The idea of fighting a virus with soup and blankets seemed completely unreasonable. Yet, Zorak's curiosity was piqued. He decided to monitor Brian's recovery as a case study, documenting every step for later analysis. Later that day, Zorak found Brian in the station's common room, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping from a steaming mug. His nose was red, and his eyes were glassy, yet he seemed oddly content. "Engineer McLeod," Zorak said, sitting down across from him, "I must protest your lack of medical intervention. This behavior is reckless." Brian smirked. "Relax, Doc. It's just the flu. My immune system will take care of it." "Your immune system?" Zorak asked, astonished. "You are relying entirely on your immune system to fight this virus?" "That's how it works," Brian said. "The fever means my body's fighting back. The soup's just for comfort." Zorak's mandibles twitched. "You are intentionally raising your core temperature? Do you not understand the potential for cellular damage?" Brian shrugged. "It's not that high, just enough to make the virus uncomfortable." Zorak stared, his recorder discreetly capturing the conversation. He had read about human fevers in the archives, but seeing it firsthand was something entirely different. The Solthar immune system was far more precise, deploying nanites to target pathogens without causing widespread inflammation. The idea of intentionally increasing body temperature to combat infection seemed barbaric. Yet, here Brian was, alive and coherent despite his alarming symptoms. Over the next 2 days, Zorak closely observed Brian, monitoring his temperature, tracking his hydration levels, and analyzing blood samples. Despite Zorak's grim expectations, Brian's condition gradually improved. By the 3rd day, his fever had broken, and he was back to his usual self, joking about having defeated the flu without breaking a sweat. Zorak's recorder was filled with notes, yet they only raised more questions. How could such a primitive approach to illness be so effective? Was it a quirk of human biology, or was there something more at play? As Zorak compiled his data, Brian returned to the lab, holding 2 mugs of what he called chicken noodle soup. Figured you could use a break, Brian said, setting 1 mug down in front of Zorak. Zorak eyed the steaming liquid with suspicion. What exactly is this soup? Brian grinned. It's good for the soul. Zorak doubted that, but he took a cautious sip. The soup was warm and salty, with soft chunks of what Zorak assumed were vegetables and protein. It was surprisingly pleasant. As Brian leaned back in his chair, sipping his own soup, Zorak couldn't help but ask, why do humans insist on such primitive methods? Surely, there are more advanced treatments available? Brian shrugged. Probably, but this works for us. Sometimes simple is better. Zorak mulled over his words, his antennae twitching thoughtfully. Perhaps there was something to be learned from humanity's unconventional methods. He wasn't sure why he kept returning to Brian's side. Perhaps it was the scientist in him, driven to uncover every aspect of this strange recovery process. Or perhaps it was something else. A growing fascination with how humans seem to embrace their vulnerabilities as natural parts of life rather than flaws to be eliminated. The following day, Brian's symptoms returned, stronger than ever. His voice was almost gone, his coughs shook the walls of the station, and he looked as though he had been through a meteor storm. But, once again, there he was in the common room, wrapped in the same blanket, surrounded by tissues. Morning, Doc, Brian rasped as Zorak entered. Engineer McLeod, Zorak said, his antennae stiff with concern. Your condition has worsened. You must allow me to administer antiviral treatment. Brian waved a dismissive hand, his blanket slipping. No, I'll be fine. Just a bad day. Happens sometimes with the flu. My body's still fighting. Zorak sat beside him. Your insistence on letting this virus run its course is irresponsible. What if your immune system fails to eliminate the pathogen? It won't, Brian said with a grin that quickly turned into a coughing fit. I trust my body. It knows what it's doing. Zorak couldn't decide whether this blind faith in his biology was admirable or insane. On Solthar, no one would risk their health like this. But Brian's confidence seemed unshakable, even as his condition deteriorated. Perhaps you should at least stay in isolation, Zorak suggested, to prevent spreading the virus. No need, Brian said, shaking his head. Everyone else got their flu shots. Flu shots? Zorak asked, unfamiliar with the term. Yeah, Brian said. Vaccines. Tiny doses of the virus to train our immune systems. Most of the crew's already immune to this strain. I'm just the unlucky one who caught it. Zorak processed this new information. He had read about human vaccination practices but had never seen them in action. The idea of deliberately introducing a pathogen into the body to build immunity seemed risky, yet it clearly worked. For the next several hours, Zorak hovered nearby as Brian alternated between sipping soup and napping under his blanket. The usually lively common room was quiet, with only Brian's labored breathing breaking the silence. Zorak busied himself with his recorder, documenting every detail. Day 3 of observation, Zorak muttered into the recorder. Subject continues to exhibit symptoms consistent with influenza, including elevated body temperature, persistent cough, and general lethargy. Despite the absence of medical intervention, the subject remains confident in his recovery. Further data collection required to determine the validity of this approach. As the hours wore on, Brian's fever climbed higher, and Zorak could see the strain on his face, his hands trembling as he reached for his mug. It was almost too much for Zorak to bear. Engineer McLeod, he said firmly, this has gone on long enough. Your body is clearly struggling to manage the infection. If you do not accept treatment, you may suffer permanent damage or worse. Brian cracked one eye open and managed a weak smile. Doc, I appreciate the concern, but you've got to trust the process. My body's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Zorak stared, incredulous. You're risking your life based on a hypothesis, not a fact. Brian grinned weakly. Experience. Humans have been dealing with the flu for centuries. We know how to handle it. Zorak's mandibles clicked in frustration, but he kept his composure. Brian's condition was alarming, but there was something undeniably compelling about his determination to see it through. By evening, Brian's fever had reached a critical level. Zorak finally convinced him to allow a diagnostic scan, which revealed that Brian's immune system was indeed on overdrive. White blood cells swarmed like an army, targeting the virus with a precision that Zorak couldn't help but admire. "It's remarkable," Zorak admitted, reviewing the data. "Your immune system is expending a tremendous amount of energy to combat the pathogen. I'm surprised you haven't collapsed from exhaustion." "Thanks," Brian murmured, barely audible. Zorak hesitated. "You require nourishment to sustain this effort. I'll get more soup." Brian chuckled weakly. "See? You're starting to get it." Zorak returned with another steaming bowl, placing it carefully in front of Brian. The human accepted it with a nod of thanks, his hands trembling as he brought the spoon to his mouth. "Why soup?" Zorak asked after a moment. Brian shrugged. "It's easy to digest, keeps you hydrated, and feels nice when your throat's sore. Plus, it's comforting." "Comforting?" Zorak repeated, testing the unfamiliar word. It wasn't a concept he often considered in his work, but it seemed to carry significant weight for humans. As Brian sipped his soup, Zorak observed in silence. Despite his confusion and frustration, Zorak couldn't deny the results. Brian's body, battered though it was, fought valiantly, and perhaps, just perhaps, there was something to this strange combination of rest, soup, and blankets. By the time Brian finally fell asleep, Zorak found himself with a strange sense of respect for his human subject. Brian's methods may have been unconventional, even reckless, but they were undeniably effective. The next morning, Brian's fever had begun to subside. Zorak, who had stayed by his side throughout the night, was starting to doubt the human's faith in his so-called process. Brian awoke with a groan, his voice a raspy shadow of its usual strength. His eyes were bloodshot, and his movements sluggish. "Good morning," Zorak said, though there was no optimism in his tone. "Your condition has not improved. I insist you allow me to administer treatment." Brian shook his head, pulling the blanket tighter around him. "It's just the flu, Doc. I just need a little more time." "Time may not be on your side," Zorak replied, his antennae twitching in frustration. "Your immune system is clearly overwhelmed. At this rate, you risk severe dehydration, organ stress, or worse." Brian gave him a tired smile. "You worried too much." Zorak stared, his compound eyes narrowing. "And you worried too little." Reluctantly, Brian agreed to another diagnostic scan. The results were similar to the day before, but Zorak noticed subtle signs of progress. Inflammation markers were stabilizing, and Brian's immune response, though still intense, seemed to be gaining control. "Your body shows signs of improvement," Zorak admitted. "But the strain on your system is unsustainable. You must consume more nutrients and fluids." Brian laughed weakly. Fine, I'll make more soup." "No," Zorak said firmly. "You will stay here. I will retrieve the soup." The kitchen was a new frontier for Zorak. He had observed humans preparing food but had never tried it himself. Fortunately, Brian's stash of instant soup provided a straightforward solution. Zorak followed the instructions carefully, boiling water and stirring the dehydrated contents until they resembled the substance Brian called chicken noodle soup. When Zorak returned, Brian was dozing in the common area, his head lolling to one side. Zorak placed the bowl gently on the table, the warm aroma filling the air, and nudged Brian awake. "Eat," Zorak ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Brian blinked groggily but obeyed, lifting the spoon with trembling hands. He managed a few sips before pausing to grin at Zorak. "Not bad, Doc. You might have a future in catering." Zorak ignored the comment, focusing on Brian's vital signs. His fever remained high, but his pulse and respiration were stable. It was a paradox. Brian's condition seemed dire, yet under control. As Brian continued to eat, Zorak retrieved his recorder. Day 4 of observation. Subject's symptoms persist, but some physiological markers indicate early signs of recovery. The continued reliance on rudimentary treatment methods, primarily rest, hydration, and soup, remains baffling. Further investigation required. Brian chuckled softly. "You're really fascinated by this, huh?" Zorak looked up, his antennae twitching. "Your methods are unconventional. They defy all principles of modern medicine." "They work, though," Brian said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Sometimes you don't need fancy tech. Sometimes you just need the basics." Zorak wanted to argue, but he couldn't deny the results. Brian was improving, albeit slowly, but undeniably so. As the day wore on, Brian's energy returned. He even managed a brief walk around the station, though Zorak insisted on accompanying him to ensure he didn't push himself too hard. "You're like a mother hen," Brian teased as they strolled down the empty corridors. "I fail to see the humor in your situation," Zorak replied dryly. "Relax, Doc. I'm getting better. You'll see." Zorak wasn't so sure, but he had to admit Brian's resilience was remarkable. By evening, Brian's appetite had returned, and he polished off a second bowl of soup with surprising vigor. "You seem pleased with yourself," Zorak observed. "Of course," Brian said, leaning back with a satisfied sigh. "Told you I'd beat this." Zorak didn't respond, but his antennae twitched thoughtfully. Brian's confidence was contagious, even if it was utterly irrational. That night, Zorak stayed in the common room, watching over Brian as he slept. The human's breathing was steady, his fever finally beginning to subside. For the first time since the ordeal began, Zorak allowed himself a small hope. As he recorded his observations, he found himself reflecting on the broader implications of Brian's recovery. What if humanity's approach wasn't just a product of ignorance or stubbornness? What if it was an adaptation? A way of life that valued simplicity and self-reliance over technological dependence. The idea intrigued him. Perhaps there was more to learn from humanity than he had initially thought. The fifth day began quietly, with Brian stirring awake from what appeared to be his first peaceful sleep in days. Zorak, who had been reviewing his recordings, immediately noticed the change. Brian's complexion was less pale, his breathing steadier, and his movements no longer sluggish. "Good morning," Brian said, his voice still rough but steadier than before. "Your condition has improved significantly," Zorak noted, his antennae twitching in relief. "It seems your immune system has successfully neutralized the pathogen." "Told you it would," Brian grinned. "Just needed a little time, some soup, and a whole lot of sleep." Zorak couldn't suppress a clicking sound of disbelief. "This entire ordeal has been a case study in biological chaos. Your body endured a fever that should have caused severe complications, yet you appear unharmed." "Well, not entirely unharmed," Brian said, stretching. "Pretty sure I lost a few pounds sweating through that fever, but hey, I'm still standing." Zorak's nerves were frayed. "Engineer McLeod, your recovery is nothing short of miraculous, yet you continue to treat this matter as though it were inconsequential." "Because it is," Brian replied. "Humans get the flu all the time. It sucks, but we bounce back." Zorak clicked his mandibles in frustration. "You trivialize an event that could have been fatal without proper intervention. This behavior is reckless, even for a human." Brian shrugged. "Reckless or not, it works. Besides, I wasn't alone. You were here, keeping an eye on me." The comment caught Zorak off guard. He hadn't considered his role in Brian's recovery as anything more than clinical observation. But perhaps there was some truth to the human's words. As Brian slowly regained his strength, Zorak reflected on the events of the past week. The experience had been both frustrating and enlightening, challenging his assumptions about medicine, biology, and resilience. Brian's recovery wasn't just a testament to the human immune system. It was a glimpse into the philosophy that seemed to guide the species as a whole. On the sixth day, Brian returned to his duties, though Zorak insisted on accompanying him to ensure he didn't overexert himself. The station had remained largely stable during Brian's illness, but minor repairs and adjustments were always needed. As they worked side by side in the maintenance bay, Zorak couldn't help but ask, "Do all humans approach illness with such nonchalance, or are you an exception?" Brian laughed, the sound echoing in the metallic space. "Most of us do. We've been dealing with stuff like this for so long, it's just part of life. You get sick, you rest, you get better. And when you don't get better?" Zorak pressed. "Then what? We try something else," Brian said. "Doctors, medicine, fancy tech, whatever it takes. But most of the time, we don't need all that. Our bodies know what to do, and we trust them to do it." Zorak considered this as he adjusted a calibration tool. The idea of trusting one's body to handle a life-threatening situation seemed absurd. Yet it had worked for Brian. Later that evening, the two of them sat in the common area, sharing a meal that Brian had insisted on preparing himself. The soup was heartier this time, with chunks of meat and vegetables floating in a rich, fragrant broth. Zorak found the flavor surprisingly enjoyable, though he suspected it had more to do with the satisfaction of shared effort than the soup itself. "You know," Brian said between bites, "you've been a pretty good sport through all this." I think I might have driven you a little crazy with my primitive methods. That is an understatement, Zorak replied dryly. Your refusal to accept advanced treatment was both maddening and inexplicable. Brian grinned. But you learned something, right? Zorak tilted his head. I've learned that humans are an enigma. Your biology defies conventional understanding, and your approach to illness is unorthodox, to say the least. Take that as a compliment, Brian said. We're full of surprises. Zorak couldn't argue with that. The humans were, without a doubt, the most perplexing species he had ever encountered. But they were also fascinating, resourceful, and undeniably resilient. As Brian cleared the dishes, Zorak activated his recorder one last time. Final observation. Subject McLeod has fully recovered from the influenza virus without the aid of advanced medical interventions. Recovery was achieved through a combination of rest, hydration, and the consumption of nutrient-rich liquids. While this approach is inefficient by Solthar standards, it proved effective for the subject in question. Additional studies are recommended to better understand the unique characteristics of human physiology and their implications for broader galactic medicine. Brian returned to the table, wiping his hands on a towel. You're going to write a whole report on this, aren't you? Of course, Zorak said. Your recovery raises important questions about the role of simplicity in medical care. It may even prompt a re-evaluation of certain Solthar practices. Glad I could help, Brian said with a wink. As the two of them sat in comfortable silence, Zorak found himself feeling something he hadn't expected: respect. Humans might be chaotic, unpredictable, and maddeningly stubborn, but they were also remarkable in their ability to endure and adapt. And though Zorak would never admit it, he had grown to admire them.